Okay, picture this. You're walking through your town on a sweltering summer day. You're just going about your business, maybe heading to the market, when you spot a woman dancing in the middle of the street. At first glance, no big deal, right? People dance. But then she doesn't stop. She dances through the morning, into the blistering afternoon, and deep into the pitch black night. It honestly sounds exactly like the opening sequence of a psychological horror movie. But here's the crazy part. It isn't fiction. This actually happened. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to unpack one of the most bizarre and, frankly, truly terrifying events ever recorded in human history, the Dancing Plague of 1518. It's a mystery that perfectly blends historical trauma with human psychology, so let's just dive right in and try to unravel it together.
Because you see, this wasn't some joyful happy jig. Hours pass. Then a full day goes by. Then another. This lone woman danced entirely without music, without rest, and without any logical explanation whatsoever. I want you to picture the sheer physical toll for a second. We are talking about dancing through total exhaustion, through agonizing muscle cramps, through literally bleeding feet. And as she just kept moving, others actually began to join her. Soon, what started as one solitary person morphed into dozens of people, all caught in this same terrifying, relentless rhythm. It got so bad that some would eventually collapse from heart attacks. Others literally died from sheer exhaustion right there on the cobblestones.
So you're probably wondering, when and where did this absolute nightmare unfold? The year was 1518. We're in the city of Strasbourg, which at the time was a highly prominent part of the sprawling Holy Roman Empire. Now, this wasn't some small, isolated village out in the middle of nowhere. This was a major, bustling center of commerce and life. And yet, it somehow became ground zero for an epidemic that would absolutely baffle doctors, city officials, and historians for centuries to come.
Section 1. The first dancer, Frau Trophia, starts the madness.
Now, to really understand how this whole thing kicked off with our patient zero, Frau Trophia, we absolutely have to look at the environment. Strasbourg was essentially a tinderbox, just waiting for a spark. In July of 1518, when Frau Trophia stepped out of her home and began her frantic movements, life was, well, it was incredibly difficult. The population was dealing with frequent, severe food shortages. Disease outbreaks were terribly common. I mean, the vast majority of the population lived these highly stressful, deeply uncertain lives just trying to survive from one single week to the next. The citizens of Strasbourg were physically and mentally exhausted before anyone even took a single dance step. The way this whole thing builds is where the story goes from strange to just absolutely terrifying. On day one, Frau Trophea starts dancing. Days later, she's still going, completely unable to control her own limbs. Her neighbors naturally assumed she'd eventually tire out, right? But she didn't. And here is the most chilling part. Within a single month, hundreds of people had joined her in the streets. Hundreds. It was this massive, sweeping contagion of movement. The entire city was witnessing an epidemic that nobody had ever seen before and, maybe more importantly, that absolutely nobody knew how to stop.
Section 2, a disastrous prescription, the official response.
So as the days passed and the crowd swelled, real panic truly set in. Like I said, this wasn't a party. Some of these dancers were actively screaming in pain. Others were weeping and begging for help, pleading for someone to stop them, yet their bodies just kept violently moving. The doctors of Strasbourg examined these exhausted, bleeding dancers and actually came up with a diagnosis: hot blood. In 16th century medicine, this basically meant an overheating of the body's humors. And their prescribed cure? Well, the doctors genuinely believed that the afflicted needed to vigorously physicalize the illness. They needed to literally dance it out of their systems. So, based on that incredibly flawed medical advice, the authorities put together an action plan. And I just want you to imagine the sheer absurdity of this for a second. Step 1. They cleared the public spaces, specifically making more room for the dancers. Step 2. They actually spent taxpayer city money to hire professional musicians to play music to keep the dancers moving. Step 3. They built large wooden stages in the town squares so the afflicted could dance more efficiently. They were faced with a mysterious, deadly dancing epidemic, and their official, sanctioned response was to aggressively encourage even more dancing. Yeah, as you might guess, the result was completely disastrous. By officially sanctioning the dancing, bringing in music, and building stages, the authorities essentially poured gasoline on a fire. The number of dancers absolutely skyrocketed. The physical toll reached a total breaking point. Reports from the time suggest dozens of people began collapsing right there on the wooden stages. People began dying in the streets from strokes and catastrophic heart failure. The plague had essentially become a mass casualty event, and it seemed entirely unstoppable.
Section 3. Searching for Answers. Modern Investigations. When we look at modern historical investigations, kind of like detectives on a cold case, the theories generally fall into two main camps. On one side, we have a biological suspect, ergot poisoning. And on the other, we have a psychological suspect, mass psychogenic illness. Let's break down the evidence for both and see which one actually holds up. Let's start with the ergot theory. Ergot is a type of fungus that commonly grows on damp rye grain, which happened to be a massive staple of the diet in 16th century Strasbourg. Now, this fungus is highly toxic and naturally contains brain-altering chemicals that are actually really closely related to modern hallucinogens. If the city's grain supply was contaminated, well, it could certainly cause widespread hallucinations and bizarre, erratic behavior. Makes sense, right? However, many modern experts completely reject this theory. Why? Because ergot poisoning triggers severe physical symptoms like gangrene and a total loss of motor control. Having those symptoms would make continuous rhythmic dancing physically impossible. And that brings us to the psychological theory, which honestly is the one many historians favor today. Think back to those brutal living conditions we discussed earlier. Strasbourg was literally buckling under the weight of famine, rampant disease, crushing economic hardship, and this intense religious fear, the deep-seated belief that God or the saints were actively punishing them. Human beings can only take so much trauma. Extreme, inescapable stress can sometimes cause the human mind to essentially short-circuit. So this theory suggests the dancing plague was a mass psychogenic illness, basically a physical manifestation of overwhelming psychological distress shared by an entire community. The absolutely crucial point here is summarized perfectly by this observation. When one person began dancing, others unconsciously followed. It was the human mind's desperate, completely involuntary response to a society that felt like it was just collapsing around them. Frau Traffe's initial break from reality acted like a spark. Her neighbors, who were already drowning in the exact same shared anxiety and trauma, unconsciously mirrored her. It created this incredibly powerful, self-reinforcing cycle. The more people danced, the more normal and totally inescapable the compulsion became for everyone else watching. Section 4. How the Madness Ended. The Final Intervention. Okay, so after weeks of chaos, death, and total exhaustion, the city authorities finally realized that their musical stages and the whole hot blood diagnosis were a fatal, catastrophic mistake. Here is the final intervention they rolled out to try and save the surviving citizens. Step 1. They immediately banned all music and public performances. No more stages, no more encouragement. Step 2. They loaded many of the exhausted dancers onto wagons and transported them out of the city to a nearby shrine dedicated to Saint Vitus, who, ironically enough, was the patron saint of dancers. Step 3. They performed solemn religious rituals, and believe it or not, it worked. By removing that massive public spectacle and shifting to a calm, structured spiritual intervention, the mass hysteria finally began to break. Gradually, the dancing faded. The exhausted citizens finally stopped moving, and normal life slowly crept back into the streets of Strasbourg. But as we wrap up this explainer, some really profound questions still remain. Why did it really begin? Why did it spread with such terrifying wildfire speed? 500 years later, despite all our modern science and historical hindsight, nobody truly has a definitive answer. You see, history isn't just about dates and kings. Sometimes it's about the deeply fragile nature of the human mind itself. For several weeks in 1518, an entire city found itself trapped in an agonizing nightmare of endless movement. And to this day, it remains one of history's most fascinating, chilling mysteries. So, what do you think pushed them over the edge? Keep exploring the past, and I'll see you in the next